You've probably heard the headlines. Muammar Gaddafi, the so-called mad dictator, killed in Libya back in 2011. Evil, ruthless, tyrant. That's what the mainstream narrative tells you. But let me ask you something straight. What if the core reason Libya was targeted had less to do with humanitarian impulse and more to do with something far simpler? A nation refusing to lock itself into the global financial and geopolitical priorities of Western powers. Today we go beyond surface explanation. In this illumination session, we're going to explore what Libya looked like under Gaddafi, what he offered his people, why he was seen as a threat by powerful external interests, and how intervention unfolded with devastating consequences. We'll break down the social programs, the massive infrastructure projects, the gold-backed currency plan that rattled global institutions, and the narrative used to justify war. But before we begin, let me be clear. I do not participate in party politics. I follow no ideology. What you're about to hear comes entirely from publicly available evidence, government disclosures and documented reporting. This episode is about patterns in global power, not allegiance to any flag or doctrine. Welcome back to the Luminary Room. I'm your host, Nico, the voice behind 369 Lumineer, and this is episode 22. Libya was executed for disobedience. Today's illumination session is going to explore the dismantling of Libya, the removal of Muammar Gaddafi, and the patterns of Western intervention that follow when a nation refuses to conform to external interests. Let's begin with what most people never hear. Under Gaddafi, Libya operated for decades without external debt. Its social programs were funded directly from oil revenues, not loans from international banks. There was free healthcare, free education, free electricity, interest-free loans. Newlyweds received tens of thousands of dollars to buy a home. Mothers were given cash on the birth of a child. Citizens received a share of national petroleum profits. Petrol itself cost some of the lowest prices globally, barely 14 cents per litre. The Central Bank of Libya was state-owned and printed its own money to support these programs. The International Monetary Fund certified that Libya was debt-free as the NATO assault began in 2011. Think about the implications. A nation rich in resources that chose to distribute wealth rather than borrow to survive. A social safety net rooted in domestic capacity rather than external dependency. A flagship achievement was the Great Man-Made River. This was an enormous civil engineering project that tapped underground aquifers to deliver fresh water across Libya, supplying roughly 70% of the population. This wasn't a small well or a localised irrigation scheme. It was a multi-billion-dollar network of pipelines stretching thousands of kilometres. Every time you hear desert nation, picture instead a landscape where water no longer dictated life, at least until intervention dismantled the very infrastructure that supplied it. Economic indicators also tell a story rarely discussed in mainstream media. Per capita income in Libya under Gaddafi rose above $11,000, placing it amongst the highest in Africa. The Human Development Index was one of the continent's best, with significant gains in literacy, education and healthcare. Urban housing programs accommodated the majority of residents, and literate enrolment rates soared across generations. These weren't partial gains. They were across-the-board improvements in living standards, and they were measurable. But any nation that chooses economic independence within a global system anchored by powerful states will, in this day and age, draw scrutiny. In 2009, as chairman of the African Union, Gaddafi proposed a unified African currency backed by gold. His vision was for a gold dinar that could replace, or at least offer an alternative to, currencies tied to Western financial institutions. The intent was to create trade independence for African nations, reducing reliance on external currency systems dominated by the US petrodollar and the euro. Articles from diplomatic cables quoted at the time indicate that French leadership in particular viewed this as a direct threat to their financial influence in former colonies. Now, imagine the reaction from entrenched powers when a resource-rich nation proposes such a thing. It wasn't simply an economic idea. It threatened the global structure that makes countries reliant on dollar-based finance, the same system that recycles petrodollars into US treasuries, fueling American fiscal dominance. Gaddafi's concept, if expanded across Africa, had the potential to divert trillions of dollars annually away from Western banking structures. Pause and consider that tension. Not just a president's policy, not just a dictator's whim, but a structural challenge to financial hegemony. History shows that when economic autonomy emerges as a genuine option for nations, the global reaction is seldom neutral. Patterns from other eras confirm this. In Iraq, the justification for invasion rested on weapons of mass destruction that were never found. In Vietnam and Korea, ideological threats were deployed to rationalise intervention. Similar narratives have framed foreign actions in Syria, Argentina and Iran. And more recently, earlier this month, the removal of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Now, these episodes illustrate a recurring theme. When a nation steps outside dominant geopolitical expectation, pressure builds, and intervention often follows, and swiftly. Now, back to Libya. The narrative used to justify offensive action in 2011 was packaged in humanitarian language, protecting civilians, ending the violence. But the operation reality was heavy aerial bombardment coordinated with rebel factions and targeted strikes on infrastructure. Operation Unified Protector, led by NATO under a UN Security Council resolution, enforced a no-fly zone and carried out airstrikes that disabled significant components of Libya's civil systems, including portions of the water network which was built to sustain millions of lives. Think about that for a moment. An operation presented as defensive turned into offensive strikes against infrastructure that provided water, electricity, and the material basis for everyday life. The result was not a smooth transition to democracy. Instead, Libya fractured. What was once a centralised state with significant social programs and economic planning dissolved into competing militia control, parallel governments, and pockets of foreign influence. Tripoli, Benghazi, the east and the west of the country all became arenas of division rather than unified governance. And this fragmentation has long-term consequences that echo beyond Libya's borders. Fuel smuggling networks have emerged at massive scale, with losses to the national economy in the billions of dollars each year. Infrastructure that once supported a relatively cohesive nation now feeds regional instability and illicit trade that fuels conflicts in neighbouring states. Now let's pause again and address the capture and killing of Gaddafi himself, a moment that encapsulates the brutal end of a sovereign figure who dared to be different. As Gaddafi fled his last strongholds, a US drone tracked his convoy and alerted NATO forces. French jets struck vehicles ahead of him, scattering his group. Gaddafi, his son, and his remaining companions took shelter in a concrete drainage pipe. They were found, pulled out, and beaten in a chaotic scene captured on mobile phones. Gaddafi, wounded, asked, "What did I do to you? And do you know right from wrong?" Questions that haunt that footage. Reflect on the optics of that moment. It was not a trial. It was not a negotiation. It was the end of a man outside any formal judicial context, broadcast to the world as regime change completed. Let that sit. What followed was not reconstruction with respect, but a complete collapse of national institutions, education systems, healthcare networks, and housing programs that had been built over decades deteriorated. Women's rights, previously protected under laws of equality and employment, came under threat from emerging factions that rejected the secular policies of the earlier era. Libya's engagement with global institutions, such as the World Bank, conveniently resumed only after the state was dismantled. Formal collaboration on rebuilding was reignited in 2006, ramped up post-2011, and continued despite the ongoing conflict. The sequence tells an important story: destroy first, rebuild later, and on terms shaped by external powers who now had influence over the outcomes. So ask yourself this: how does a nation with no external debt, abundant resources and rising development indicators become labelled a failure merely years later? And patterns repeat. In Korea and Vietnam, conflict was justified to contain ideas and systems that threatened established interests. In Iraq, the rhetoric of weapons and liberation masked deeper economic and geopolitical motives. In Argentina only this month, intervention narratives obscured strategic priorities. Now, once you see the trend, it's hard to ignore how language is used to justify outcomes that align with certain interests. And let's be clear here, this isn't about romanticising any leader. It's about examining how global power operates when confronted with independence that doesn't fit the prevailing economic order and narrative. So what does Libya teach us? It suggests that when a nation pursues genuine independence, socially, economically, politically, that can be perceived not as sovereignty, but as defiance. And when defiance challenges concentrated power, the narrative machinery engages to reframe, justify, and eventually reconstruct the world around that nation. Patterns, not personalities, tell the deeper story here. Patterns repeat because systems repeat. When a nation controls its own resources, rejects debt dependency, and refuses to subordinate its fixture to external financial power, the responses follow a familiar arc. First comes moral framing, then comes diplomatic pressure, then sanctions, then intervention. The language changes each time, but the destination rarely does. As I've said, we've seen it in Korea, framed as containment, in Vietnam, framed as defence for freedom, in Iraq, framed as imminent danger, in Syria and Iran, framed as stability and security. In Argentina and across Latin America, it's framed as economic correction. The pretexts shift, but the outcome remains consistent. Independence becomes a liability. Sovereignty becomes provocation. And the aftermath is always sold as unfortunate, unintended, or unavoidable. Failed states, endless reconstruction, humanitarian crises that somehow require the same actors who caused the collapse to manage the recovery. The same institutions that arrive after the damage is done, offering loans, restructuring, and oversight in exchange for influence. This is not chaos. This is order enforced. What Libya shows us is not an anomaly but a case study. A country that tried to step outside the system was brought back into line, not through debate or diplomacy, but through destruction and narrative control. Once you see this pattern clearly, it becomes harder to unsee it elsewhere. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If independence continues to be treated as defiance, how many more nations will be required to learn this lesson the same way? You can also read more about today's topic in my written essay on Medium. It's free, no subscription required, and you'll find the link in the summary notes. So if this conversation feels worth keeping alive, sharing this episode and subscribing to this channel helps ensure these discussions continue to reach beyond this room and that you don't always believe everything governments and legacy media peddle to you. Until next time, I encourage you to question how sovereignty, independence and human welfare are often sacrificed for the benefit of nefarious global powers, and what that means for the next nation that dares to say no. As always, stay curious, stay critical, and stay aware. This is Nico, signing off.